So today, over 2 billion people live in states where being homosexual is a crime. In 13 states, homosexuality is still punishable by death. And in a further 73, LGBT individuals can be imprisoned because of their sexual or gender identity. Even in states where homosexuality is not a crime, LGBT people often face prejudice, marginalisation, discrimination, hostility and violence. And it's therefore unsurprising that LGBT people often seek asylum in countries where LGBT rights are more protected. But even though sexual identity and gender identity are understood as grounds for refugee status, nevertheless the success rates of LGBT people seeking asylum is very mixed. And so to discuss why that is the case, to think about ways of improving this situation, we brought together this roundtable on queer asylum in Europe. It follows on from an academic conference that we had last year, but today we wanted to focus particularly on individuals who work in sort of policy area or in activism or in both, to discuss these issues from that perspective. But before I start, I wanted to thank the European Institute for sort of helping set this up, and also for providing the funding, which we got from the European Commission through their John Monnet funding scheme. So I shall now sort of introduce our speakers. Our first speaker tonight, and the speaker giving the keynote address, will be Peter Grady, who is the Senior Legal Officer for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. His work spans issues from the avoidance and elimination of statelessness to international protection, and he has worked globally for the UNHCR in Hong Kong, Washington, Geneva, and also London. He will be giving the keynote tonight on the topic of protecting LGBTI refugees, a UNHCR perspective. He will speak for about half an hour. After that, our three other panel members will sort of comment on his talk or sort of raise issues related to his talk. And then we'll have half an hour for sort of discussion and questions from the floor, after which I hope you'll join us for sort of drinks, which are sort of being set up slightly noisily in the room to the side. So to my immediate left is Liz Barker, or the Right Honourable Baroness Barker of Anagach, to use your... Is that correct? Full title?
No.
Is it not? Wikipedia has lied to me.
No, this is incredibly important.
Yes.
I am just the Baroness Barker, because I am the first one.
Okay.
So I have a of, but you don't use it. Then there are other Barkers, and they have to use their ofs. So
okay, so you're the original.
So I can tell a lawyer, a comma is incredibly important.
So the Baroness Barker is a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords, where she is the Lords LGBT spokesperson, among other roles. Before entering the House of Lords, she worked for over 20 years for H Concern. She's currently patron of Open Doors London, a charity which provides support for older LGBT people. And she's also an ambassador for the Albert Kennedy Trust, a charity which helps young people who are homeless, living in a hostile environment, or in housing crisis. To her left is Maud Gober, who's currently project manager at Micro Rainbow International, where she leads on their Safe Housing project, providing accommodation to homeless LGBT asylum seekers and refugees. She was previously an LGBT asylum support worker for the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, where she provided support to LGBT asylum seekers in immigration detention centres. In addition to that, Maud is also Director of Community Engagement at UK Black Pride, which is Europe's largest not-for-profit organisation for African, Arab, Asian and Caribbean heritage LGBT+ people. And at the very end of the table is Paul Delane. Paul Delane is outgoing Executive Director of Kaleidoscope Trust, which is a leading charity dedicated to promoting and advancing equality and human rights of LGBT people internationally. He was also recently appointed to the UK government's first LGBT advisory panel, which will advise the UK government on its policies concerning LGBT people. Without further ado, I would ask Peter to now to give his talk. You have half an hour, so please.
Thank you very much. I have to make one correction as well, I'm afraid, Richard. I've never worked in Washington.
Have you not?
I've heard this come up before for some reason, but I haven't, unfortunately. Maybe in future. On to my presentation. Firstly, it's a pleasure to be with you here tonight and to take part in this roundtable on queer asylum in Europe. I'd like to thank as well the UCL European Institute, and in particular Richard, for extending this invitation to UNHCR to speak. I'm also very grateful to be joined by our distinguished panel members and look forward to both hearing from and learning from you this evening. Now, the topic of queer asylum in Europe and more broadly the protection of LGBTI refugees globally is of immense importance and concern to UNHCR. LGBTI refugees face hostility and discrimination on various levels through the displacement cycle. Having fled persecution in their country of origin, they can then face repeated discrimination and persecution in their country of asylum. The grant of refugee protection in many states, that is, if refugee protection needs are identified, does not necessarily provide a solution for the cycle of violence and harm, and LGBTI individuals continue to face risk. The issue goes to the core of UNHCR's mandate to provide international protection to refugees and presents complex challenges to UNHCR and its partners in delivering on their respective responsibilities. In my presentation, I'll give a brief overview of the legal framework for the protection of LGBTI refugees before outlining some of the key challenges faced by LGBTI refugees, as well as UNHCR and others in responding to those challenges. I'll then focus more squarely on the theme of today's roundtable, which is the adjudication of asylum claims in Europe. Now, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, which is the cornerstone of refugee law, speaks directly to the topic of this symposium. Despite the fact that there was no explicit recognition in the refugee definition of persecution for reasons, recognition in the Refugee Convention and in the definition of persecution for reasons of sexual orientation or gender identity, the drafters of the Refugee Convention used broad enough language to cover such instances, most notably through the introduction of the membership of a particular social group ground. Although there's little guidance given on the ground, including in the travaux préparatoires for that convention, the framers of the convention would have been very much alive to the issue, including through the then recent and horrendous treatment of LGBTI people in Nazi Germany. It is now well established that the Refugee Convention definition of a refugee does and should accommodate LGBTI individuals who regularly live their lives in fear of death threats, physical and sexual violence, or serious discrimination. Recognition of this clearly follows a proper interpretation of the provisions of the Refugee Convention consistent with that convention's object and purpose. The very purpose of the convention is to protect those who manage to flee predicaments that violate their dignity, their identity and freedoms. At the center of the convention is human dignity in the widest possible exercise of these fundamental rights and freedoms without discrimination, including those related to sexual orientation and gender identity. This recognition, however, was not always in place. It has taken some time since the convention was signed and ratified for the protections it provides to LGBTI refugees to become more widely recognized. In terms of refugee law development, progress can be traced to jurisprudential interpretations and policy guidance, particularly around the membership of a particular social group ground, which I mentioned earlier, and some of which I'll touch on later. Without going into the history of these developments, it's worth recognizing that particular relevance in the European context of the Qualification Directive, which purposefully recognizes that the membership of a particular social group ground might include groups based on the characteristics of sexual orientation and gender identity. Similarly, with respect to the Council of Europe, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in its 2010 recommendation noted that member states should recognize that a well-founded fear of persecution based on sexual orientation or gender identity may be a valid ground for the granting of refugee status and asylum under national law. Parallel developments in international human rights law have helped ensure growing awareness and protection of LGBTI rights. These include the 2007 Yogyakarta Principles and the 2017 Yogyakarta Principles +10, which were adopted by a group of human rights experts and, although not binding, reflect well-established principles of international law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. Principle 23 outlines the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution related to sexual orientation and gender identity. It provides that states shall ensure that a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics is accepted as a ground for the recognition of refugee status, including where sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics are criminalized, and such laws directly or indirectly, which is important, create or contribute to an oppressive environment of intolerance and a climate of discrimination and violence. These principles have been drawn on numerous occasions by the United Nations, including UNHCR, by states, activists, courts, and tribunals. Pursuant to its international protection mandate and supervisory responsibility under the Refugee Convention, UNHCR has promoted the correct interpretation of the Refugee Convention with respect to individuals at risk of harm and persecution related to sexual orientation and gender identity. It has done this through a range of means. These include the convening of expert roundtables on refugee claims based on sexual orientation and gender identity, the publishing of guidelines on inter alia gender-related persecution, the membership of a particular social group ground, and in 2012, the issuance of our guidelines on claims to refugee status based on sexual orientation and/or gender identity, as well as through third-party interventions before national and supranational courts, including the UK Supreme Court in the leading case of HJ Iran, which I'll touch on later, as well as before the Court of Justice of the European Union and in other jurisdictions. Now onto the general situation for LGBTI individuals. Despite some positive legal developments, LGBTI individuals continue to experience serious human rights abuses and other forms of persecution due to their actual or perceived sexual orientation and/or gender identity. Among others, some behavior and appearance may be perceived as not conforming to social, cultural, and religious norms, which may expose them to harm. Due to these experiences of violence and discrimination, sometimes combined with other causes of displacement, such as armed conflict, ethnic violence, or targeted human rights violations for other reasons, many LGBTI individuals flee their home countries to seek protection abroad. As I noted earlier, intolerance towards LGBTI individuals is pervasive in a number of countries with first asylum, and LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers may be under a continuous threat of human rights abuses due to discriminatory laws and hostile societal attitudes. Where possible, many seek the perceived protection and greater anonymity of urban centers, away from refugee camps and settlements, only to find themselves struggling with daily survival, discrimination, and violence. In some contexts, LGBTI refugees struggle to access the services available to other refugees, such as healthcare, education, self-reliance assistance, as well as registration and refugee status determination. Local integration options in the first country of asylum thus may be limited or prove to be non-existent. The stigmatization and harm faced by LGBTI people can take different forms, ranging from daily low-level harassment to immediate threats to life and freedom. The violence and abuse can be perpetrated by state as well as non-state actors, including agents of the host state, such as police officers or healthcare officials, local residents, other refugees, or family members. A number of countries, both countries of origin and countries of first asylum, maintain laws that criminalize consensual same-sex relations, creating an unsafe and intolerable environment. The International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, their 2019 report on state-sponsored homophobia, for example, provides that as of March 2019, there are 70 UN member states that criminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts. 68 of these have laws that explicitly criminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts, and 2 more criminalize such acts de facto. Such laws have been found by international and national courts to violate human rights, including the rights to equality, privacy, and non-discrimination. Human rights reports have also emphasized a link between criminalization and homophobic hate crimes, police abuse, torture, and family and community violence faced by LGBTI refugees, persons, I should say, more widely. Even when these laws are not enforced, their mere existence often reflects and promotes a culture of intolerance. The targeted persecution of individuals on account of their sexual orientation and gender identity also takes place across the European continent. ILGA reports that for 2019, while the number of LGBTI people who have fled their countries within and outside Europe is not decreasing, still too few European countries are taking all necessary measures to ensure that LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers are treated with the dignity, care, and safety they deserve. The same report highlights worryingly prominent trends in Europe, including widespread hate speech by public figures and religious leaders which goes unpunished, public authorities banning or failing to protect prides and other public events, attacks against human rights defenders, bans on the formation and registration of LGBTI NGOs, and the outright persecution of LGBTI individuals. These are multiple challenges faced by the LGBTI community. They include the negative impact of anti-gender groups that pollute public discussions and political advances on trans equality legislation, on equal recognition of diverse forms of families, on inclusive education, or access to information about LGBTI issues. The protection situation facing LGBTI refugees in Europe can require a host of interventions on the part of UNHCR and its partners. One particular challenge for UNHCR concerns the identification of protection risks, as LGBTI individuals can be reluctant to identify or report instances of violence or harassment against them. This is due to the fear of further persecution by state and non-state agents and can be exacerbated by a lack of awareness about the availability of protection services and the difficulties some LGBTI individuals face expressing their experiences in commonly recognizable terminology. There is also, as the EU Fundamental Rights Agency reports, a notable lack of data on hate crime against LGBTI individuals across Europe. UNHCR's work in many operations is therefore focused on improving identification and outreach to LGBTI persons of concern. This can be by using reception and registration practices to convey the entitlement to protection under the Refugee Convention for persecutions on grounds related to sexual orientation and gender identity, and to ensure safe environments for potential LGBTI asylum seekers. We also seek to use partnerships to assist with outreach to potential LGBTI asylum seekers and establish and strengthen referral pathways to assist asylum seekers with concerns related to sexual orientation and gender identity. Furthermore, and depending on the circumstances of the case, UNHCR will support efforts to access justice, support the provision of appropriate accommodation, including safe houses, and undertake efforts to identify durable solutions for at-risk LGBTI refugees, including through prioritized third country resettlement. While these wider issues relating to LGBTI protection certainly warrant dedicated discussion, I'd like to turn directly to the focus of this roundtable, namely concerns relating to the adjudication of asylum claims based on sexual orientation and gender identity by states. UNHCR has long observed concerning trends in this area, which I'll briefly set out. Many of these concerns have also more recently been noted with respect to asylum decision-making in Europe, including by the EU Fundamental Rights Agency in its 2017 report on the situation in the EU of LGBTI asylum seekers. The first concern is the issue of discretion. The expectation that LGBTI individuals can avoid persecution simply by hiding their true identity and concealing their sexual orientation or gender identity, and as a result would not be entitled to the protection of the Refugee Convention. This approach was rightly dismissed by the UK Supreme Court in the 2010 decision of H.J. Iran, which I mentioned previously is a case that UNHCR made a third-party intervention in. The judgment of the court recognized that the approach runs counter to the rationale of the Refugee Convention, which provides that, and I'm quoting the judgment here, people should be allowed to live their lives free from the fear of serious harm coming to them because of their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Further, if the price that a person must pay in order to avoid persecution is that he must conceal his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, then he is being required to surrender the very protection that the Refugee Convention is intended to secure for him. Although we have seen relatively widespread recognition of the judgment of HJ Iran and the position it provides on discretion, including in state asylum policy and training materials, we continue to see problematic approaches to the issue and misinterpretation. These fail, for example, to acknowledge fear of persecution as a motivation for concealing behavior. In other words, where there isn't always an appreciation of the true impact on individuals of intolerant societies and the very real consequences, namely persecution, of being open with respect to sexual orientation and gender identity. Furthermore, we've seen instances where states have not fully acknowledged that the fear of persecution need not be the only motivation for being discreet, and that it only needs to be a material reason for the behavior. This has been observed by UNHCR not only with respect to claims involving sexual orientation and gender identity, but the issue also extends to other refugee grounds under the Refugee Convention, including, for example, religion. UNHCR has made multiple court interventions in cases raising the discretion issue, including in this jurisdiction. The most recent being the 2017 case of LC Albania, involving a young gay male from Albania. And in the context of religion, the case of WA Pakistan, both of which were before the Court of Appeal, I should say, of England and Wales. The issue remains somewhat confounding, therefore. While it is right to acknowledge the progress of HJ Iran and that it represents in clarifying the approach to assessing asylum claims involving discrete individuals, and to a degree it is positive to see attempts to reflect that decision in guidance to decision makers in some states, 9 years on from HJ Iran, we continue to see problematic approaches to the issue. The second trend is criminalization, and how to determine whether laws criminalizing same-sex relations amount to persecution. This issue was addressed, albeit in a limited fashion, in the Court of Justice of the European Union decision of X, Y, and Z. In some jurisdictions, however, the mere existence of laws criminalizing same-sex conduct is insufficient for recognition of refugee status. Recent or regular enforcement of the law is required. Some countries also require that applicants show that steps towards enforcement have actually been taken in his or her individual case. In our view, as outlined in our guidelines on sexual orientation and gender identity, even if irregularly, rarely, or ever enforced, criminal laws prohibiting same-sex relations could lead to an intolerable predicament, rising to the level of persecution. Depending on the country context, the criminalization of same-sex relations can create or contribute to an oppressive atmosphere of intolerance and generate a threat of prosecution for having such relations. The existence of such laws can, for example, promote political rhetoric that can expose individuals to risks of persecutory harm. They can also hinder persons from seeking and obtaining state protection. Now, moving on, there are concerning practices of sexualization and stereotyping which relate to the collection of evidence to substantiate asylum claims. Sexualization concerns the overemphasis by decision makers on sexual acts rather than sexual orientation as an identity. This can result in unnecessary and humiliating questions concerning the details of an applicant's sexual practices, which in Europe have been found to be contrary to the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, and in particular the right to human dignity and respect for private and family life. This overemphasis on sexual acts overlooks the fact that LGBTI people are often persecuted because of the threat they represent to prevailing social and cultural norms, rather than any specific sexual act. Stereotyping relates to the reliance on personal assumptions or stereotypes to conclude if somebody is or is not LGBTI. The practice is particularly problematic owing to the lack of guidance provided by many asylum decision-making bodies on assessing LGBTI claims. We've seen this in the European context, for example, with decision-makers seeking to focus on questions relating to the location of gay bars or meeting spots in the country of origin and country of asylum. Not only does this reflect stereotypical depictions, it also reflects a lack of recognition of the fact that in many contexts, LGBTI individuals will hide their sexual orientation or gender identity, and thus be unable to answer these questions for very valid reasons. A further trend concerns a culture of disbelief, which we see in asylum systems across Europe, and the resulting expectation of unreasonable levels of evidence to be provided in support of claims to be LGBTI. This is particularly problematic where LGBTI individuals have been forced to be discreet in their country of origin and hide their sexual orientation or gender identity. The situation is also compounded with gaps in country information on the situation of LGBTI individuals in the asylum seekers' country of origin, which would help verify their claim. Delays in claiming asylum are also seen as a basis for adverse credibility findings. This is despite the fact that many LGBTI asylum seekers are unaware that they can claim asylum on grounds related to sexual orientation due to the perception that asylum is political. Many are also not ready to talk about their identity, as they have hidden it in shame for so many years in the countries where they came from. The assessment of credibility in LGBTI cases needs to be undertaken in an individualized and sensitive way. UNHCR considers exploring elements around the applicant's personal perceptions, feelings, and experiences of difference, stigma, and shame to be likely to help the decision maker ascertain the applicant's sexual orientation or gender identity. Instead, we continue to see authorities requiring irrefutable evidence to establish membership of the LGBTI community. For example, of psychiatrists and medical doctors being assigned to confirm sexual orientation. We've seen states seeking to rely on the Rorschach ink blot test to test the credibility of claims to be gay. In 2018, the Court of Justice of the European Union found the practice to be unlawful. Contributing to the above concerns is the lack of dedicated guidance on assessing LGBTI claims in Europe, which I've already mentioned. This shortcoming was also highlighted recently in the EU Fundamental Rights Agency's 2017 report on LGBTI asylum seekers. Despite some states now having in place relatively sophisticated guidance to decision makers, there are many without national guidelines for interviewing LGBTI persons, assessing their claims, or providing dedicated country information and policy. The gap in guidance also extends to the provision of dedicated training to officers on decision-making in this area. It is for this reason that UNHCR has developed its guidelines, including the guidelines on claims to refugee status based on sexual orientation and/or gender identity. These are designed to provide advice on substantive, procedural, evidentiary, and credibility issues to ensure a proper and harmonized interpretation of the refugee definition with respect to LGBTI individuals. While we have seen strong take-up of the guidelines in some jurisdictions, there is still a significant amount of work to be done in promoting its principles with asylum authorities. UNHCR continues to do this through trainings, legal interventions in individual cases, and regular exchanges at meetings with asylum authorities, judges, and other relevant state and non-state actors. Promoting guidance and policy change will, of course, not fix the very significant issues we are seeing in asylum decision-making in this area. There is an ongoing need to address issues of ignorance and prejudice which continue to undermine the adjudication of LGBTI claims. In this regard, UNHCR has made a concerted effort in recent years to strengthen its training to UNHCR staff, partners, and government on LGBTI protection, including on a wide range of issues such as terminology, global issues, the types of discrimination and persecution LGBTI persons face, how to successfully communicate with LGBTI people, problematic assumptions we may have that can impact the provision of effective assistance, refugee status determination, and resettlement. 2017's comprehensive UNHCR IOM training package provides an example of this, while UNHCR has also reinforced its own mandatory learning programs, which are for staff, to improve understanding within the organization. UNHCR also continues to strengthen its age, gender, and diversity mainstreaming and ensure that operational programming prioritizes and is designed to strengthen protection responses and interventions for LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers. You may also be aware of our efforts to reach out to and consult with experts in this area. Just this month, UNHCR launched a series of consultations to identify ways of ensuring that LGBTI refugees are better protected against harm and are able to seek justice and support where they experience violence and discrimination. Similar consultations and partnerships in the past have helped to define UNHCR's work on LGBTI protection, and the organization will continue to join forces with expert individuals and organizations to ensure that LGBTI refugees are protected wherever they are. We are, of course, also very grateful for forums such as this symposium on queer asylum in Europe as means of discussing and contributing to efforts to improve the protection afforded to LGBTI refugees. In summary, therefore, there are multiple challenges to the adjudication of LGBTI asylum claims, both within Europe and abroad. And the challenge of getting asylum decision-making right is but one of a wider set of serious protection concerns facing LGBTI individuals in asylum settings. Although there has been some progress in these areas, there remains much work to be done, which will remain a priority for UNHCR going forward. In his statement marking the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, our High Commissioner underlined the importance of this work, providing that, and to quote, "The fight for LGBTI rights is about each of us. It is about our diversity and our humanity." Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter, for that very detailed and thought-provoking presentation. Without further ado, I would like to sort of ask our other panel members to give their own responses, and perhaps we can start with the Baroness.
Thank you. I've recently started to do some sessions for in Parliament. We've built an education outreach centre, so we get lots and lots of schools coming to do visits, and to be honest with you, I'm never quite sure what to expect. And about two months ago, I looked at who were coming in, and there was a sixth form, and there was some little kids, and I thought, oh, the sixth formers will be fine, and the others I'm not so sure. How wrong was I? The sixth formers were all a bit sad. The 8-year-olds, they were absolutely fizzing and buzzing. There was questions flying off the place, and all of a sudden this kid asked me, "What is your favourite law?" I thought, what a cracking good question. What is my favourite law? Okay, well, I said, I'm going to be checking out two, actually. My favourite two laws are the Human Rights Act, because the Human Rights Act says you, me, we're all, but we are all human beings and we all have basic rights. And alongside that is the second one, which is the Equality Act, which is the one that says, right, okay, we're all human rights, but we're all a bit different, and some people need a bit of assistance in order to have true equality. Next, I said. They also, I have to say, a bunch of 8-year-olds, their next question was, how are you going to stop Brexit? Because it's going to be awful. And the connection between those two things is quite important. I don't know whether you've noticed it or not, but 3 times now, the Conservative Party have announced that following Brexit, they will scrap the Human Rights Act. Yes. They have said that it is safe until 2020. Then it will be followed by a British Bill of Rights. So the people who brought you Section 28 and Brexit are going to tell you that they are not going to dilute human rights at all. And I'm sorry, I absolutely do not believe that. I really don't. Sorry, today of all days, I'm just I'm just giving it where it is. Because I am of an age. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Section 28 coming in, and I was there and lived through all of those cases going to the European courts to be settled. The pensions cases, the tennis, our right to serve in the military, fought tooth and nail by governments of both, not just Tory governments, but governments of both stripes. And it was the European courts that really did amplify and accelerate us to the point where, all right, yeah, we started on our own 50 years ago to decriminalise, but our LGB equality was really accelerated over the last 20 to 30 years by our membership of the European Union, resting as it does on the Charter. So let me just say that. I'll also say that I'm moving us back a little bit from the detail, but into the politics of it all. I don't go abroad a lot, but I do go on some trips, and I've been a lot to the Balkans, and I have to say the process of EU accession has had a profound effect upon those countries. At least at the level of their lawmaking, if not culture. When the president of Kosovo drops into the conversation that they have a gay pride and nobody gets beaten up, well, you think, okay, I really wouldn't like to be out and gay in Kosovo, to tell you the truth, but at least it's a step. It absolutely is a step forward, and I think you can look at the progress in countries which are accession countries versus those that are not and are looking more towards Russia. In terms of treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, Paul, I don't want to steal Paul's thunder, but he and I took part about 2 years ago with a load of Commonwealth activists we're a two-way meeting between us, obviously in a trendy lawyer's office in the city, and some activists in South Africa, and we Skyped and all. And they were talking about the situation, how South Africa deals with asylum seekers from other parts of Africa. And there was that huge parallel, all those issues that you talked about competence, training, inappropriate questioning, all of that. But what was good to see was, we had a lot of similarities, but to know that there was this supranational entity in which the European Union is, in which human rights are not only the subject of legislation, but there are resources that are put into various different agencies to make sure that in many different ways those values become the norm. I would just say this: if we just look at the politics of it all, I don't see homophobia, transphobia, biphobia in the Middle East or Africa going away anytime soon. Not least because of the funding which comes from evangelical Christians into Africa, from America. And therefore, I think that however much we do and we will continue to support activists and human rights defenders in those countries, there will continue to be a sort of very consistent level of asylum seeking from those countries. And I do think that it is right that we have consistency across the European Union. Woe betide you if you show up in Hungary these days and are openly gay. It's really not, it's not the place to be. And I think that we do need to continue to continue to be an active part of it. I'm part of the All-Parliamentary Group on Global LGBT Rights, and we take our lucky existence as parliamentarians in one of the best places in the world to be gay as a responsibility to use our influence to make life better for other people around the world. I sincerely hope that Brexit does not happen. If you have not voted, please vote. Polls are open until 10 o'clock this evening. But if in the god-awful event that Brexit does happen, then I think that a big question for the UK is how will the influence which the UK has had politically, along with key actors like Germany and Sweden as well, the Nordic countries, and the Netherlands, in driving this agenda within the EU. I'm not sure that that's been part of our Brexit negotiations, but there will be a deficit on LGBTI rights within Europe if we were to go. And I sincerely hope that if that happens, that some of us continue to push on it, because this is life and death for people, and we can't wish it away.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. My voice is very low. Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you very much, Peter, for your speech. I think from Peter's speech, I picked up a lot of experiences of LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees like myself. I've gone through the system as a lesbian asylum seeker, and I think at the time I went through the system, it was it has changed. There are some improvements, but there's still a lot of challenges. Back then it was really challenging. You had to prove yourself, and there were ridiculous questions that I had to answer, including how I could be a lesbian and I was a mother. So it was really bad. I think one of the things that I would like to pick on is the actual challenges that people face when they arrive in safe countries and they seek asylum or seek refuge. They can be still unsafe, which comes to the work that we do at Micro Rainbow. We have asylum seekers who still experience homelessness, and picking on from what Peter said, people still face homophobic abuse within refugee spaces. So initially it could be that they feel safe if they're not visibly, if they cannot be visibly identified as LGBT, if they put in refugee camps, or in the case of the UK, if they put in government housing that support asylum seekers. You share in these houses, you share with other refugees, and at times you share with people from your own home country. So as asylum seekers and refugees, there's a culture of supporting each other and safety networks. So people will ask you, what are the grounds you're claiming on? It's not necessarily just to be nosy, but refugees have found a way to band together and help each other. So sometimes they ask, just curious to want to help you if it's political asylum. Maybe they know a lawyer from the same country, or a lawyer who is quite helpful and knows a lot more about your country. So they try and ask that. But if you can't establish why you're claiming asylum, then there are questions already. Or if you're visibly LGBT, then you already have a problem if you're living with people who are extremely homophobic. I'll give an example of someone we supported in Micro Rainbow International. We had a young lady who was intersex. They were moved into government accommodation in Liverpool, but because their appearance was visibly female, but their birth certificate said male, they were sent to a male household. So the men in there were saying, why do you look so feminine? Although they were trying not to wear feminine things or to be overly feminine, but this is who they were. So it became a problem so much that they were almost sexually abused, so they were moved again. But again, they were moved into a male household, which became extremely violent, and they were physically attacked, and they were moved again before they were moved finally to our safe housing for LGBTI people. That is the most place that they say they felt quite safe. They could wear their dresses without being abused, without being forced out. At times, they actually chose to go and sleep in the lounge, or sometimes to try and find other friends to go and suffer safe than to stay in their government accommodation. So this is true in a lot of cases. People actually leave their accommodation because they are afraid. They are afraid to report to the authorities, and although their fear is unfounded, we must remember that people are coming from a country where if you are LGBT and you're going to report to the authorities, they're not going to be supporting you or giving you the help that you need. So people already fear that. They're still getting used to the country and that they're safe. And also, they're afraid that it will impact on their asylum claim. And they're also afraid that if no action is taken and they still have to live with the same people, then they will face further abuse. And there's also an empathy that refugees naturally have for other refugees. They start thinking, if I report this person and they get in trouble, that's going to jeopardize their case or their status in the UK. So they tend to abandon accommodation and become homeless, or try and come to London where it is more open-minded, where they might get a friend. But again, that leaves people going into exploitative situations, either domestic servitude or having to give sexual favors for every favor they had. And that is all happening alongside a time where they have to be fighting for their case, finding a good lawyer, which is quite difficult these days because of legal aid cards, and they have to be gathering evidence to support their claim, or if they've been refused, I think as highlighted, there's a lot of credibility issues. They have you're either believed or you're not, and they have to sort of constantly prove themselves. So we find that people have a lot of intersectional challenges that they're facing. So it's not only them being an LGBTI asylum, so they face homophobia, and they also face xenophobia because they are refugees, and along with other refugees, they're facing homophobia, racism, Islamophobia. They also face all that, including the additional challenges that they're facing. And moving on from that, once people sort of manage to get their status, there is still the challenges of moving on, integrating, because remember, they're still pushed out from the religious communities or in spaces where refugees usually have a safety net. They are still not welcome in those spaces. So I think there is a lot of work to be done in this sector, and I'm pleased that compared to the time where I claimed asylum, there's a lot of training, there's a lot of guidance, or there's a lot of policies, and there's a lot of information for asylum seekers themselves. But the reality on the ground is that people still need support, people still need help. We opened houses safe houses for LGBT asylum seekers in London and Birmingham. At any given point, we have more than 23 people who are priority, who are on a waiting list for a bed. So that shows that there's a flow in the system. There's people who are falling through the gaps of support, and that needs to change.
Thank you very, very much.
Well, thanks very much to Richard and UCL for organising this important event. I think that any space where refugees themselves, practitioners, civil society, politicians, people in power can come together to discuss these issues is important in the context of a global refugee crisis where more people have been displaced than at any time since the end of World War II. And increasingly, in some parts of the world, countries and regions, LGBT rights, the protection, the respect of the fundamental human rights of LGBT people are going backwards. Former champions like Brazil, their support we can no longer rely on at the level of the UN, even taking into account the fact that former administrations in Brazil have been champions of LGBT rights at the international level, violence against LGBT people in that country and other countries we can use as example is endemic. To refer to Liz's point, almost exactly a year ago actually, Liz is right, we hosted a roundtable bringing together civil society, activists, refugees from the UK and South Africa. Very different parts of the world, but similarities, striking similarities in the failure of laws to be applied, the inability of people to access the protection to which they're entitled, but the many other concerns that LGBTI people have when seeking asylum. Yes, as Liz says, these are cases of life and death, but also xenophobia, racism, access to safe and secure housing, medical treatment. And actually I'm delighted that Liz mentioned it because today in Pretoria, our partner Access Chapter 2, Steve Letsike, a veteran activist from the movement, launched an important piece of research into the lived experiences of LGBTI refugees. So from great distances, we want to congratulate Steve and her team because that research, those facts, that testimony from LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees themselves is vital if change is going to be created. The lack of data, the lack of research, it's a critical challenge to our movement. It's sort of sobering today as the Prime Minister is gripping onto power and as Brexit continues to unfurl in this country. Maud will remember that when we worked together at UKLGIG 2 days after the Brexit result was announced, we marched through central London with over 100 LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees who did not want the Brexit result to stop them from marching freely and from participating in Pride. I have to say I was nervous about the response that our service users were going to receive on that day, and actually there was an outpouring of support and respect for the fact that these members of our community, some of the most marginalised and vulnerable, wanted to take their place in Pride celebrations. Like Liz, I am concerned about the consequences of Brexit, what that means for fundamental rights in this country as we seek to remove ourselves from the European Union. I would just start by saying that although I sit as a member of the government's LGBT advisory panel and one of the 75 commitments in the 2018 action plan concerns asylum, the views I express are my own and are not part of official government policy or the other members of that group. I will also declare that I've been commissioned by the Independent Advisory Group on Country Information, an academic body that sits under the ambit of the Chief Inspector of the Home Office to conduct a review of country information policies concerning sexual orientation and gender identity. That review won't be published until later this year, and I don't want to preempt that report. So whilst I welcome the fact that the independent body is considering how issues of sexual orientation and gender identity are dealt with in Home Office policy, the outcome of that report remains to be seen. I will say I think it is significant that the 2018 LGBT Action Plan published by the government includes a commitment to asylum. The reason I say this is this year marks 16 years since I started working with LGBTI asylum seekers at a small regional firm in Swansea, where some of my first cases that I assisted on as a paralegal concerned LGBT people, LGB and T. And as Maud has said, and as we're right to recognise and in fact celebrate to some extent, there has been a marked change in law, in standards, in guidance and training. But we have to recognise the challenges that remain at the forefront of our minds. I remember the times when it was very difficult indeed to find any parliamentarian that was willing to speak up on these issues. And I pay tribute to Liz, who is one of the most committed and ardent champions for equalities issues, including asylum, within government and along with others, many others these days. And it's fantastic and important to see people raising these issues across the aisle. For a long time we relied on the now departed Lord Avebury. When he passed away, his son described him in an obituary in The Guardian as the patron saint of unpopular causes. And certainly the protection of LGBTI asylum seekers was a distinctly unpopular cause 15 years ago. This should not be regarded as a party political issue. For the reasons that Liz, Maud and Peter have alluded to, the protection of fundamental human rights, the right to seek asylum, that should not be a party political game. And any parliamentarians that's willing to add their voice to the cause, that's very welcome, especially at a time across Europe when populism is on the rise and xenophobia distressingly seems to be increasing. Although I think it's important that asylum features in the 2018 LGBT action plan, one of the issues that continues to concern me is the use of immigration detention in the United Kingdom. It is unusual to me that a country that proclaims the legacy of Magna Carta never seems to be far from the mind of ministers. We even named the Equality Fund at the Foreign Office Magna Carta. They seem to forget the fact that we are the only country in Europe that has unlimited, indefinite detention for migrants and asylum seekers. Some of you will be familiar with the case of Aderonke Apata, a lesbian Nigerian woman, the executive director and founder of African Rainbow Families, which on a shoestring provides peer-to-peer support, services and assistance to LGBTI people seeking asylum. Her case, famously, she was in the asylum system for 13 years, and for 14 months she was detained in Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre. Yarlswood has become a byword for cruelty internationally. And significantly, several years ago, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, during a visit to the United Kingdom, was prevented from visiting Yarlswood. It is shocking that a country like the UK would prevent an independent expert, a UN mandate holder, to visit a place of detention. As a matter of foreign policy, the APPG on global LGBT rights, of which Liz is a founding member and the vice chair, in 2015 conducted an inquiry into the role of the UK government in promoting LGBT equality around the world. And at the time I was the director of UK LGIG, the UK's national LGBTI asylum charity. We were very clear with parliamentarians at the time, and I'm glad that it's an argument that won the day, that Britain cannot stand on the world stage and seek, even in good conscience, to encourage other countries to respect the human rights of LGBTI people whilst denying protection, support, refuge to LGBTI people seeking asylum. And to this day we welcome the recommendations of the APPG's first report. Of course, when Britain, like other countries, seeks to engage foreign administrations on how they treat LGBTI people, there can often be a response of the West versus the rest. These aren't our values, these aren't the human rights that we subscribe to. But with Britain, it's even more profound an issue, because of course it's the former colonial power. And we should recognise that of those 70 countries that continue to criminalise around the world that Peter mentioned, over half criminalise directly with laws that trace their origins to Britain's colonial past. And this is significant, because of course in our country we see diverse people from different corners of the world. The laws, the oppressive structures that they're fearing originate from Britain, which raises the question of what should Britain's stance be on the world stage? How should it engage with these countries in dialogue? Last year, Britain hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting with heads of state, leaders from all 53 of the member states of the Commonwealth. We cannot discuss the criminalisation of LGBT people around the world without discussing the Commonwealth. Only 2 countries were never colonised by Britain, and of the 53 members of the Commonwealth, 35 to this day criminalise LGBT people. Britain was not going to be able to host the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting without talking about LGBT rights. We were going to make sure of that at Kaleidoscope Trust, as was the APPG. But the profound question is, what should Britain say and do? At Kaleidoscope Trust, we're a founding member of the Commonwealth Equality Network, which currently comprises 53 organisations in 46 countries, working collectively, irrespective of our size, our resources, or where we are in the world, to engage with each other in joint advocacy aimed at promoting equality, justice and inclusion for LGBT people. In January 2017, we convened the network. As Kaleidoscope Trust, we act as its secretariat to strategise as diverse organisations around the world, different cultures, different languages, different religions. What do we want from this conference? How can we ensure that heads of state, parliamentarians, decision makers hear the voices of civil society, of LGBT people? How can we create real change? It was the first time that LGBTI civil society had been officially welcomed into the conference. And significantly, the British Prime Minister Theresa May issued a landmark statement of deep regret for Britain's role in exporting these laws around the world. Now, I accept readily that the Prime Minister did not apologise in the strictest of senses. The word "I'm sorry" or "we're sorry" did not feature. That was not a significant surprise for us, because Britain is very nervous about saying "I'm sorry" for aspects of its colonial past, because it has financial repercussions. Nevertheless, Global South civil society asked Britain to make this statement. It wanted Britain to grapple with its history, with its legacy of exporting these laws. But also, Global Civil Society asked Britain, what will you do to help us in the future? We're at the front line trying to dismantle these laws. And as an example, one of our partners, GALC, tomorrow will receive judgment from the Kenyan courts as to whether or not the criminalising laws in that country are in compliance with the country's constitution. Whilst not prejudging the outcome of that ruling, it's safe to say that Kenyan civil society is optimistic. So we wait with bated breath to see whether the number of criminalising countries in the Commonwealth is about to decrease. After that, we all watch to Botswana. At the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the Prime Minister announced £5.6 million of funding via the Equality and Justice Alliance, of which Kaleidoscope Trust is one of the implementing partners, to do 3 things: to provide essential financial resources to civil society activists who are at the front line of trying to dismantle these laws, so that they can work intersectionally with women's rights, children and women's rights organisations to seek law reform. Because it is significant that Britain didn't just export discriminatory laws which continue to impact LGBT people, but for the reasons Maud said, we also exported laws that fundamentally discriminate against women and girls and engender violence. At Kaleidoscope Trust, our ethical approach to activism is the core of everything that we do. What we wanted to enable is to the British government to funnel direct financial resources to civil society that need it the most. And over the last few months, we've worked directly with women and children's and LGBT organisations in Namibia, Botswana, Mauritius, St. Vincent and Fiji, who have formed those intersectional movements, or the resources that we provide sustain movements that already exist, so that they can continue to advocate for themselves for the reform of these laws. Another aspect of the programme, which is more sensitive, is that the Coalition provides direct technical and legal assistance to governments who on a voluntary basis want to reform those laws. We were at pains to emphasise that too often Western governments, including the UK, have sought to lecture or hector countries. Whilst we should never away from defending fundamental human rights, countries have voluntarily sought to subscribe to human rights standards. It was important that the Prime Minister said, we encourage you to change those laws, and if you want assistance, these resources are available. I can't say, unfortunately, which countries are currently involved in that programme, but it is encouraging that countries in different parts of the world want to get rid of laws that effectively they were lumbered with, but for reasons of capacity, technical expertise, have been unable to do so up until this point. I think the final remarks I want to make are about where we're heading. As Maud said, things have changed, but any asylum seeker that is facing sexualisation, violence in immigration detention, the system is not working and there's more to do. Civil society is at the forefront of creating change, because often organisations like Micro Rainbow, UK LGIG, see things that government officials do not see. We can bring it to their attention to seek to remedy them. If that doesn't work, to take it to parliamentarians who can raise it formally. It is encouraging to me that across Europe, from Lesbos, in Italy, in Sweden, small groups, often unfunded, often led by LGBTI refugees themselves, are being formed. It was always confusing to me to be told by refugee funders that your charity is not an LGBT charity, it's a refugee charity, and vice versa. Intersectionality is not fully understood. These organisations need vital resources in order to provide services to LGBTI people. It is important that LGBTI refugees themselves are taking positions of authority and leadership. The power of that testimony has real potential to create change, and that's why I'm delighted partners like Aderonke has set up an organisation like African Rainbow Families to advocate for themselves. 2 years ago I was involved in a project called Yoga Carta Principles Plus 10, an initiative that Peter referred to. This sought, on the 10th anniversary of the original publication of Yoga Carta, to seek to respond to developments in international human rights law. YP in 2007 made the important point that a person seeking asylum on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity has a legitimate claim to be determined. But much of the 10 years afterwards concerned decision makers, governments and courts grappling with the questions of what you can do, what is permissible, and what you can't do. I drafted the section of YP plus 10 which concerns state obligations on asylum. I would say in my defence that 34 other people endorsed it, so anyone who doesn't agree with it, I'm happy to have that debate, but it's not just Paul's view on international human rights law. The process included significant jurists, both the current and former UN independent expert on combating violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I'm under no illusion that many countries will not agree with what we say in YP plus 10. As far as I'm aware, UNHCR's last estimate, I'd be happy if Peter corrects me because it's distressingly low, is that only 45 countries of the 193 UN member states expressly, as a matter of law or policy, recognise that SOGI is a ground for asylum. That is too low, and there is much work to be done to ensure that wherever LGBTI people are in the world, that they can access a fundamental human right, which is the right to seek asylum, and that right is increasingly under threat today. Europe can continue to lead the field. As Fra has said, too few countries have formal policies, too little training is provided to officials. Whilst the UK has made important steps forward, its ranking in the European Rainbow Europe Index has continued to fall from number 1 in 2014 So just last week we were told we're number 8. Britain will not be able to climb higher in the rankings until it grapples with issues of legal gender recognition, issues of the protection of intersex children, and in my view, asylum.
Thank you. So, we've had a chance to speak. We would now like to sort of open the floor, ask for any comments, questions. I believe there's a microphone going around. Or you can just sort of bellow out your questions if you have an imposing voice. So I think we'll take sort of a couple at a time. So we'll start with this side of the room. So I think there's 3 questions, and then we'll move over.
Hi, this is Carmen. I'm a PhD student here at UCL. I have a couple of questions. First, thank you all for your wonderful talk. And the first question is maybe more around UNHCR guidelines and the policies in different European countries. But how do officials deal with the idea that people applying for asylum, queer people that are applying for asylum, that are coming from different backgrounds and different countries, not all of them do have the same idea of sexuality or gender identity that is expressed in their in the host country here in the UK, for instance. So, for example, where I come from, Egypt, not every trans person will describe themselves as trans. Not every man who has sex with men will describe himself as gay. They might have other descriptions for who they are, and a lot of the time, where people do express themselves in terminologies of the global north, class is usually involved. So the people from lower classes or from working classes are usually not as associated with those global concepts. So on the level of UNHCR guidelines or in the policies in different countries, how do we address this issue of people who have a very profound fear of persecution, but they are unable to express it in ways that are legible to lawmakers and judges? The second question, if it's all right to... yeah.
We may come back in the second round, if that's all right. And so there were two questions here, and then we'll...
Yeah, thank you for this event and to all the speakers. I'm Layla. I'm the current Executive Director of UK LGIG, and I have a comment. Thank you for allowing comments. I wasn't going to put my hand up because it's normally questions only. If I can respond, because mine leads on, I think certainly in the UK context, people's inability to articulate their sexual orientation or gender identity within the kind of Western British construct is problematic. And some of the work we do at UK LGIG, well, a lot of it is helping people to explore their identities, think about what it means to them, partly for their own sense of self-esteem and well-being and confidence, but the knock-on effect is it can help them when it comes to their actual asylum claim and making the case to the Home Office that they really are LGBTQI. And a comment I wanted to make in terms of the stereotypes about LGBTQI people is that the Home Office might have moved away from sexually explicit questioning and expecting photographs or explicit videos. But there are other stereotypes taking its place, such as people being able to articulate clearly what their identity is and what it means to them. As Peter pointed out, a lot of people feel so much shame they can't talk about it. Or people come from cultures where talk about sexuality, relationships, gender identity is never discussed, let alone if you're LGBTQI. It's not culturally done. And we see people who are refused asylum, for example, because they have used insufficient emotive terminology. And I just want to explain that there is this stereotype, if we've moved away from sexually explicit questioning and identity being around sexual activity, that we see a lot of people who are being asked to explain what was their emotional journey, what was their coming out journey from childhood, sorry, I've got a copy of our report here if anyone wants it afterwards. But there's another example in here where somebody wasn't believed because they couldn't explain their lack of awareness of their sexuality before the age of 14. And this is a particular problem when it comes to women as well, who sometimes fall in love with somebody of the same gender for the first time as an adult, and then the Home Office refuses them because they say, it's implausible, we don't believe you that your first relationship, for example, was when you were in your 30s. Thanks.
My name is Victor, and I am a PhD student at Sussex in Brighton. So thank you very much, Richard, for organizing this very interesting event. I have a few questions. I'll try to be very, very quick. So to Peter, like normally you at NHCR and academia focus on protection, but they don't talk a lot about integration. So what are the activities like the UNHCR policy concerning integration of asylum seekers and refugees? And then to Mood, I really appreciated your talk because you were focusing on integration and from a perspective of somebody who lives that. You talked about a lot about accommodation. It was quite interesting. I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about employment as well, like the challenge of finding employment after someone is recognized as a refugee in the UK. And Paul, I would like to talk to you afterwards because I'm Brazilian and I've conducted research about asylum, like queer asylum in Brazil. Like Brazil is one of the countries in Latin America that recognize refugee status based on sexual orientation, gender identity. And to be honest, like the process, it's much fairer in Brazil comparing to the UK, for instance, like the legal process. But just a quick comment, I guess what we have here in the UK and we don't have in other countries like Brazil and South Africa, for instance, because now I'm studying the relation between UK and South Africa, it's the lack of supportive NGOs. So in the UK, you do have some NGOs that work, like civil society, as you finished talking, and in other countries, this is very problematic, because when we have refugee NGOs, they don't talk about LGBTI issues, and the LGBTI NGOs don't mention refugee issues at all. Sorry and thank you.
So the panel would like to respond to some or all of the points raised?
Should I start? With the first question, I thought it was a very good one, but Layla went quite some way to answering it, I think, in a very, very articulate fashion. What I will say, though, is that the issue of terminology, communicating your experience, the obstacles to doing so based on the history of violence, stigmatization, etc. This is an issue that we see across Europe. It's not, I mean, in the UK, I'd say, I shouldn't move into the area of comparing states with states, but your policies here are more advanced than in some other states. But what we would say, going to our guidelines and going also back to, I'd say, first principles of refugee status determination, is to approach, there are issues about whether interviews are being rushed, whether there's too much pressure on asylum seekers to disclose early on, and there are, say, adverse credibility findings as a result of late disclosure, which is not obviously not appropriate. On terminology, there are issues relating to how well you're training your interviewing officers or your caseworkers, decision makers on country information, how issues surrounding LGBTI protection, etc., what actually happens in the country of origin, their understanding of the reasons why an individual might be either reluctant or unable to properly articulate their experiences. I mean, it is a difficult area of asylum decision making, but it's interesting. I think a lot of it does go back to your real first principles of how to approach an RSD interview, a refugee status determination interview, appropriately. But our guidelines do speak to that, and as I mentioned previously, there's quite a bit of work to be done in terms of really ensuring appropriate take-up of those guidelines and an appropriate, well-informed approach to asylum interviewing and then decision-making. The second question on integration, that was a broader question on what's UNHCR doing there, and I won't try to answer that comprehensively, but it is, we are doing quite a bit in that space, and I'd say we're doing more recently, including through the Global Compact on refugees, where integration is a massive, massive component of what's being, what the basically the objectives of that compact. But if you look at the headquarters level, we have a division on resilience and solutions, which is focused exclusively on issues around durable solutions, of which integration is considered one of the key durable solutions for UNHCR. And then you look at the local level, most operations, and it depends on where you are, what we do. In some states where, for example, you have a country like the UK, our work is largely law and policy related, but we will be conducting, if you look on the internet, for example, we'll be conducting participatory assessments that look at the reception and integration experience of asylum seekers and refugees. We published one last year on Eritrean asylum seekers, newly recognised Eritrean refugees. There'll be more work coming up in that area, for example, with respect to children. I do think, looking specifically at the LGBTI experience of integration is something that would warrant attention from UNHCR, including in this area. But as I mentioned, integration is a big issue for us. It may not be as prominent as some of the more immediate protection work that we do, but it's certainly on the agenda, and it continues to be elevated.
Okay, I'll answer more on integration, our employment and move on work. So to explain a little bit on how Micro Rainbow works, we work in 3 ways. We provide housing support and social inclusion programs, which are designed and led by refugees themselves. And then we have the move on support. So this support we provide for anyone who identifies as an LGBTI refugee and asylum seeker. How we work in our move on work is we have our outreach officers who support people on a one-to-one basis. Whether you live in one of our houses or not, we will support you throughout, sort of to moving from an asylum seeker to a refugee into settling. So I'll give, maybe to make it more clear, an example of a person who might be in our house. So when they get granted, they get 28 days from the Home Office for their support, which is £37 a week to stop, and for their accommodation to end. So within that time frame, they have to find alternative accommodation. And usually it is private rented sector that they will move on to, because they don't exactly meet the priority list for many local councils, where you might get placed in a council housing, anything like that. So in that 28 days, before that we start, or once someone is granted refugee status, we start a one-to-one support to find out what they want to do. I think one of the things that a lot of people forget is that refugees are diversely talented, and they have a lot of professional backgrounds from their home countries. So we sit down with someone, find out what they want to do, and if they have any professional qualifications from their home country that just needs perhaps a conversion, or if they needed to first attend English lessons, we support them in, because the main issue that people face is housing. So if you don't have housing, you're not okay. So people tend not to move on if they don't have that. So we focus on finding them a place to stay. We provide CV workshops or employability support. Some of it is provided by our corporate partners, but mostly it's on a one-to-one basis. We have worked with other companies where people directly send CVs, and if they interviews, they get a job. We had such a program with Uniqlo, the clothing company, where people have been employed. So it is an intense one-to-one process that we actually have move-on officers who advocate for people. If they're more vulnerable, they will go with them to the council to find housing, or if they want to go to university, we start that whole process of explaining how it is that people apply for university in the UK. We've had so far, I think, 4 people in our housing who've gone on to university. We've had quite a few who have been employed, including one who found a job as a software engineer because they had the background in their home country. It was a matter of finding them the right connections and support. So it is an intense sort of one-to-one support, quite a few sessions to help people with that. We are actually looking for a move-on officer if anyone is interested, or if you go on our website, Microrainbow, you can retweet the vacancy. So I hope I answered your question. But we try and make a one-to-one plan with the main focus being the accommodation, because we find that once people have that in place, they do not struggle too much in looking for employment, whether skilled or unskilled.
Can I just compliment that? On the employment side of things, there's quite a bit of work going on now with respect to employers themselves and how they can develop and adapt recruitment policies and practices that are more refugee friendly. In that regard, just a few weeks ago, UNHCR, alongside some partners, we published guidance for employers here in the UK on how they could improve their practices. And this is through doing things like taking into account, for example, the language barriers that refugees might have at the beginning, tailoring your interview process appropriately so that you can give them a fair chance. And then once someone is in employment, then looking at ways in which you don't make those recruited suffer from underemployment. You give opportunities for them to progress, etc. So there's quite a bit going on in that space. The local level here, but also through UNHCR and its work with OECD as well. We've produced guidance there. There's a 10-point action plan on refugee-friendly employment.
We've got questions on this side, yes?
Apologies in advance for whatever's about to come out, because it'll be convoluted. Hello. I don't know if this is working. Is it working? So my question is based on how I understand human rights in the first place to be inherently about absolutes and to find meaning in connection that we make with one another when we discover common humanity. So the struggle that I have with the title of this is the idea that there's a kind of wholesale common approach to queer asylum across the union, the union that I'm a member of rather than the one I live in. And what I'm curious about from any of your organizations is what your responses are or what your views are of the updated American policy on trans rights. And I am aware of one person who's applied for asylum status in Sweden. I don't know of any others. I know it's obviously a complex issue because we have political considerations, but again, I come back to the question of it being absolute and being uncomfortable with the idea that we talk about LGBT rights when usually what we mean is LGBT rights. So just your views on that.
Other questions? Would you like your second question?
If there is space and time for it, if not, that's fine. Okay, the second question relates to what Maud was saying earlier about how when asylum seekers who are being housed by the government in refugee housing for a period of time, and they might face a lot of difficulties with other refugees that are housed with them because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. I'm wondering, how do we balance between having a policy that is protective of LGBTI refugees while at the same time to not nurture some sort of hostility between different types of refugees, that there is queer refugees that need to be separated all the time from other refugees. And if from your experience with other refugees, if their transnational ties, their faith-based ties are still valuable and important to them in their host country. it might be a very complicated relationship, but it's still not something that necessarily everyone wants to abandon altogether? Or what was your experience with that? Thank you.
I'll take on, I think, the question about the trans relations, their ties. Refugees or LGBT refugees still want to maintain those ties with their religion, with their culture. So it is very important to them or to us. So it's quite a challenge in finding that balance, but people do not want to disconnect from who they are. If you think about it, despite the challenges of exclusion, that is how you grew up, that is who you are, that is your religion, that is your culture. It's just that parts of it do not like you as a person, but it is parts of who you are. So there are organizations where, such as Iman, in terms of religion, there are churches, Christian churches for gay people, and organizations such as House of Rainbow and the Metropolitan Church, where people find sort of connections of who they are. And the other important thing is when we have the peer support groups, people meet people from the same culture, from the same communities, and they give each other that peer support, and they're not as isolated as they usually are. But because this has happened, it doesn't mean people disconnect from parts of their culture or religion.
I just wanted to say briefly, I understood your question as two issues, so I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong. I might be convoluted in return. In the EU, because of a push by member states, there is supposed to be harmonised law, so the same standards apply in different countries. And as the FRA, last year's Fundamental Rights Agency assessment of, I think it was 15 countries, although irritatingly not the UK, demonstrates that despite harmonised laws, the implementation varies quite considerably. And in fact, I've seen it myself in Spain, where UNHCR hosted an official training for judges and decision makers, including the Director of Asylum for Spain. So this is very helpful. And I suppose, what happens next? Do you have standards? Do you have training? We don't need standards because we've had this training. I mean, it's just an example for you. On the issue of trans, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I was involved with an initiative that was led by Transgender Europe, a membership organisation of trans civil society from across Europe, where they convened a team of trans refugees and a team of asylum experts who worked together to produce a very practical document on how trans organisations could be more inclusive for trans people seeking asylum. It wasn't just practical tips about the law, it was about power imbalances, intersectionality, racism and xenophobia, frankly, within the LGBT community. The thing I was struck by, to take your point, is few of the trans, it was mostly women, but some men involved in the project, used trans as a way to identify themselves. And as in Yoga Carta Principles, we actually don't say LGBTI at all. We refer to sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, or sex characteristics, which I feel is the best that we can do at an international level right now. You are right that the needs of trans people can be very different, and I was proud that at UKLGIG, when Maud and I worked together, we and our colleagues did this, launched Europe's first trans dedicated support group led by trans people themselves. It is significant that after much campaigning, we persuaded the UK government, the UK Home Office, to issue specific policy guidance on gender identity and asylum. That guidance has yet to be published. I'm hopeful. I'm looking at Layla. Will we see that this year? possibly. And my message to the UK Home Office is, if you do this, because they're always complaining, they never get any credit, if you do this and it's a genuinely inclusive and progressive policy, you will be one of the first countries in Europe to do so. So it's a way in which we can set an example, but as is always the case in asylum, it's the implementation that is key.
What I'm trying to get at is identity is the core of this for all of us, whatever part of LGBT you are. But if someone says that they don't recognise homosexuality, I don't really care, I mean, they can do what they want. When it comes down to it, it becomes about judging the acts that I do or who I decide to love or who I love. If I'm a trans person, then the lack of recognition of my identity is the core of the issue. And when the US revokes that recognition, it is as much persecution as a gay person being persecuted for a sex act. So the question is as much about the identity and also the second part of it, which is how this is convoluted. How do we as the European Union and as European Union countries respond to the US of all countries taking a stand?
I spend quite a lot of time in Parliament working on trans issues and also to an extent on intersex issues. I have to say that the bulk of my work is not public and visible because I spend a lot of time talking behind the scenes to civil servants and people to try and achieve stuff. And as such, I work with a group of people who come from community organisations who are in that day in, day out battering that is going on at the moment, led by the Times and the Daily Mail. And you're right, it absolutely is an assault upon the existence of trans people. And I think that the problem that we have, and I don't know how it's playing about in the media. I've met people from Malta who had a very good story to tell on trans issues. I don't know yet how we deal with the fact that we have a media which somehow seems that it is important to give a voice to people who deny the existence of another person, and that there has to be some kind of balanced debate between the two. I don't think that they would do that on other protected characteristics, such as race, but for some reason they are doing that. Journalists, who one would have hoped would have known better, are doing that. So, and we've been grappling with that for about 2 years now. We haven't yet managed to do that. What I am hopeful about is that at the moment in government, in Parliament, there is a consensus that that is wrong, and that we are going ahead. We are going ahead with things such as what we recently did. The government recently held an intersex call for evidence. For example, to try and just find out from intersex people what it is that they would, intersex being a whole different set of issues, what it is that they want us to do. I think we have to work very hard, all of us, to keep that political consensus alive. And I think that it falls to the LGB part of the community as much as anybody else to make sure that political consensus goes on. The other part that, I mean, what you said, well, it should be an absolute right. Well, yeah, it should. But, you know, an EU of 28 different countries with different streams of religion and experience, it's never going to be uniform, is it? And I think it's interesting. I mean, the all parliamentary group. We did our first report. We're about to start planning our second, and our second report is going to be about LGBT plus and religion. And that's a really how does that play with politicians? You know, and I think that's going to be a very difficult but very, very interesting thing to do, because you're right. There isn't, there is no more uniformity within any one religion about what they think on the matter, and I think it's interesting that in this country we have a social and welfare system which is different from most of mainland Europe. Most of mainland Europe, their social and welfare system is predicated either upon religious institutions or trade unions or whatever. We don't. We have got this long-standing voluntary sector and public sector which are secular. And therefore we have had the luxury of having the space of having voluntary organisations which are not in any way hidebound by religion. And therefore we come at this from a slightly different way. We are busy pushing our religions to be more open and tolerant. But I understand that in other parts of the world, everybody has a religion, whoever they are. You can't polarise the debate between LGBT and religion because everybody's religious. So my answer to that is that we have to continue to find safe spaces as long as we need them, in the hope that we eventually get to a point where the community groups which are religiously based can be open and tolerant. And when you go and talk to them, they are quite upfront about the fact that some of them are and some of them just aren't. And what they don't want to do, the best of them don't want to do, they don't want to appear to be inclusive when they're not and re-traumatise people.
Can I just say, Richard, that unless the government collapses, President Trump will be visiting London on a state visit in 2 weeks' time. And as the rights of trans people, the right of asylum is under assault in America. And I'm sure that, as like last year, people will be waiting to welcome President Trump in the way that they think he should be.
On that note, I would like to thank all of our speakers once again for what I hope you found to be a very interesting and engaging conversation.